Hello. I'm speaking to you from Romania, where I've been invited to give a talk about grandfather Owen Barfield. I'm his grandson, also named Owen Barfield. And I was looking for the theme, and I wanted to talk about the influence that grandfather had on C.S. Lewis. So in preparation for this, I asked around. I asked a senior lecturer in Lewis, and I said, well, what books are there? What reference material? And he said nothing, which really surprised me. After 60 years, there's been no work on this. I was so shocked by that. Then I asked, well, what work's been done in how grandfather influenced Tolkien? And I got the same answer. There's nothing officially been studied. But I happen to know that for Tolkien, there are 2 non-academic books and 1 academic talk, but still very little. But it's not surprising with Tolkien, because the read-through from Tolkien to Barfield is more obvious. So grandfather's cosmology, his explanation of the anthroposophic worldview, was picked up by Tolkien. Tolkien got all that from grandfather. Grandfather met Tolkien in 1926, introduced by C.S. Lewis, of course. They went on many long walks together and had mutual events together. So all this kind of middle world and stages and ages, all that comes from anthroposophy and from grandfather. And anthroposophists for a long time have known this, and they've always been wondering why nobody ever points this out. Anyway, be that as it may, to look at the Lewis influence, I had to go to grandfather's books and grandfather's works. Grandfather wrote about Lewis and gave him many sort of descriptions of Lewis throughout his literature. I'm going to put all that aside to keep this talk short, and I'm only going to look at one book, which is Owen Barfield on C.S. Lewis. So everything I'm saying now comes from grandfather. Grandfather said that Lewis had 3 personas, if you like. There was the literary critic, there was the author of fiction, but there was also the Christian apologist. But added to that, there was the pre-Christian and post-Christian Lewis. And grandfather influenced all 5 of those one way or another in different ways and different manners. What they had in common was their great friendship. They'd met at university in their first year, 1919, and what brought them together is they both saw themselves as poets first and foremost. They also shared this kind of fight against what they called positivism, but we now call reductive materialism. So they were against reductive materialism, against scientism. That's what brought them together. They had a lot in common. They were great friendships, and when Lewis died, grandfather was his literary executor. I don't want to emphasize their separateness, but for the purpose of this talk, contrast is sometimes helpful. When you see 2 shades of a color, you put them next to each other, you start to see the nuance between them. So I'm going to focus on 5 things that grandfather isolated. But these 5 things, they could be questions, and what you think about these questions is important. You should be taking them seriously. In fact, grandfather says and repeats, the way we address these 5 issues depends, the salvation of humanity depends on how we deal with these issues, which he's about to outline. The first one is sin. So grandfather says that he agrees with Tolkien. They both agreed that it's the utmost threatening sign of the times. They also agreed that it can be represented by a metaphor. But they choose different metaphors to represent this issue. In the case of Lewis, the metaphor would be a bit like a dog that's done wrong, and the master is punishing the dog. In the case of grandfather, it's a breach of trust. So just to explain that a little bit, the gulf of knowledge and knowing between the dog and its master is unknowable. The dog will never understand the mind of the master. The dog only wants to do what the master wants it to do and to please the master, but there can be no knowing the master. Grandfather says it's more like a master and servant. There can be communications. You can get to know your master. You can build a relationship. You can take that forward. And if you commit a sin, then you're breaking the responsibility that the master gave you. The next theme is transcendence. Now, this is probably the second most important thing that Lewis and grandfather discussed. And what transcendence really relates to our relationship with the divine. And if you have a transcendent relationship, then the Father in heaven is above you and you are below it. And there's this kind of up-down relationship. Whereas grandfather liked to emphasize eminence, that the divine is all around us and we can feel it more on the same plane, and also particularly find it within us. So that's the key difference. Now, for Lewis, he insisted that belief and faith were all the more valuable because they can't be known. But grandfather said, yes, belief and faith are important, but they are just stages in the human development on the way to know him. And they were sort of appropriate for a stage that is now past. We now need to move on to the next stage and find our way through into know him. And this also has an emphasis on church hierarchy. So Lewis was very supportive of church hierarchy and church authority, what grandfather calls Yahwehism. Grandfather preferred to be more Pauline. He would say things like Christ in me, Christ in you. These are phrases that Lewis wouldn't use. And the next theme is imagination, probably the one that they had most debates of all about. Now for Lewis, he said there is no link at all between imagination and truth, reality, discovery. Whereas grandfather said there is a connection. The two are connected. Through imagination, we can find truth. It is a valid way of knowing. Again, they use a metaphor to describe these differences. The metaphor is of a grand Edwardian Victorian lady standing on a pedestal. Now for Lewis, he adored this lady, but he adored it from afar. He would kind of enjoy the beauty of the lady, want to describe the lady, engage with the lady, but always from a distance. Never touching, never going up to it, never getting close to the lady, who was too far away, untouchable. Grandfather said that same lady does stand on a pedestal, but you can approach it. You can even start discussing things. You could maybe open a conversation. You could possibly start courting this lady. And if you're very lucky, you might even end up marrying her. That's what grandfather wanted to do. The next theme is, just before, imagination is so important because it was the theme of their Great War. So the Great War started in 1923, and it's lasted all the way up to Lewis's conversion. So grandfather was responsible for turning Lewis from atheism through to theism, then to Christianity, but he wasn't able to convince Lewis to make that next step into sort of deep Christianity or esoteric Christianity. But Lewis was always on a path, and if he'd lived longer, he might have got that way. But Lewis was comfortable where he was because he was getting an audience for what he had to say for that time and place. So going on to the next one, which is historicism. The thing about historicism is that it's patterns in history. So can those patterns in history give us meaning? And Lewis would say no. You can find no patterns in history. Grandfather said you can. But the reason Lewis said no is because he thought that the relationship between man's soul and God is always constant. It's the same now as it was in the past and will be in the future. Nothing will break that relationship. Nothing will make a significant change to the relationship, not even the incarnation of Christ. So, grandfather says the incarnation of Christ is the turning point in time. It can be evidenced and felt, and you can see how it changed humanity. Now, these have consequences, these two positions. Lewis didn't really believe in development, movements, groups of any time, society developing. He was not interested. He didn't even really think that the Renaissance and the Reformation really existed or made an impact on mankind. Grandfather thought in patterns of history, you can really see changes in humanity. It actually means something. He looked at it so hard that he could see an evolution within humanity, and he coined a phrase, the evolution of consciousness. Now, this phrase was coined by grandfather, and it was first used in his book, History in English Words, which was published in 1926. And the clue is in the title, history. That word history was so important to grandfather. And the last point that I want to bring in here is something called polarity. Now, polarity is when you have two things. It could be anything, but they are diametrically opposite one from the other. And the relationship of that dynamic between one and the other creates a third thing. And if you look at that third thing seriously enough or in enough depth, you can see that that third thing becomes as real as the two things that generated that third thing. This philosophy of polarity comes from Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And grandfather was a great champion of Coleridge, a great exponent. People have said that he is the best exponent of Coleridge. But the point being here is that Lewis wouldn't go there. He wouldn't take up this philosophy of polarity. And grandfather said that's a great pity, because Lewis, being a great communicator and a great populist, if he had picked it up and explained it in that way he had explaining things, what has now become romantic theology would have gone in a different direction and would have been a lot more advanced by now. What grandfather did is he stood back and he looked at the wide panorama of philosophers who had made a mark since Coleridge to see if he could find anybody who had really grasped what Coleridge was saying, could bring it into modernity, and crucially apply it in the real world. And he was more than pleased when he found the name of one person that had done that, and the name of that person is Rudolf Steiner. There's also two things that grandfather wanted to point out in this book, Owen Barfield on C.S. Lewis, which is that by the 1970s and 1980s, two confusions had already started to prevail. One is that they were applying to Lewis positions and teachings that Lewis did not hold, but they were justified by phrases and words and thoughts that came from grandfather. The other is that grandfather himself was being misrepresented and not correctly taught. Let's put that second one to one side, because that still happens, but it's more of a less of an issue. But the first one has got much, much worse since even the 1980s. We're now 50 years on from that, and he's become so confused what grandfather was teaching, what Lewis was teaching on these themes. An example of this is this phrase, baptized imagination. I asked around as well to Lewis scholars, and apparently Lewis didn't use this phrase, the baptized imagination. And I think Lewis would feel uncomfortable with it. He might even say, no, that's not where I'm going. But if you ask grandfather, he said, yes, you're on the right tracks. If you're thinking about the baptized imagination, this is the direction that we need to travel in. So that's much more grandfather's sentiment. And I think it needs to be sorted out in terms of understanding, because there's a certain amount of academic integrity about this. You need to know who thinks and says what. And anyway, this far we have come. Now, as an afterword, I want to pose a question. If this is all as I say it is, why isn't it better known? And I would suggest it's for three reasons, but there are plenty more, and you could give me some. One is the way Lewis's work was taken up. One is the nature of Lewis studies, and one is the development of Lewis's literary estate. So in terms of the uptake, already in Lewis's life, the Anglican Church became a big supporter. That was followed by the Catholic Church, then the evangelicals, and then all kind of established religions are coming in. They all feel comfortable. And that is because Lewis emphasized this transcendent nature of God, this hierarchical nature, and the need for a mediation between the individual and the God. And the church has a role in that. That's why the established churches like and called him. Grandfather is more aligned with what's called emergent Christianity, as is taught by Richard Rohr, for example, in New Mexico. Richard Rohr is a great exponent of grandfather himself. This is kind of, we have to find Christianity within ourselves. And I think if we go in future, and if the future of Christianity is to develop, we need to go down that route. The nature of Lewis studies, already in Lewis's life, the first studies of his work were being published. So we've had 70 years of Lewis's study. And again, I asked people who should know, how many books and monographs of Lewis are there? And the answer I got back is probably in excess of 10,000 books. So we've got a lot of books And there is a risk that there's a widening but not a deepening of the studies there, and particularly the biographical type study. Now, both Lewis and grandfather were not interested in biographies. They wouldn't talk about themselves. They were quite private people. They were born in the Victorian era. They didn't like, and they thought it was kind of impolite and irrelevant to talk about biography. But I'm kind of giving an example here of the sort of person who decides to do some research, and they look into what Lewis's dentist ate for breakfast on a Tuesday morning, and was it bacon or was it eggs? And the big discovery, it was both bacon and eggs. He writes a book and then puts that book on the top of that pile of 10,000. I mean, these are serious issues, and we need to be serious about it. They actually do matter. There is a danger that we're kind of creating a game of Jenga here with this pile that's toppling over, almost a Tower of Babel. So my appeal to you is, together, can we refocus and build a Jacob's ladder? The last point is the development of the literary estate. Now, Lewis passed away, grandfather was his literary executor, but because grandfather had been managing all his book affairs and had been managing all his royalty statements and payments and tax affairs, there was just continuity. Nothing changed. There was a literary agent, there were publishers, there was sort of open access to academia. But grandfather was getting old. He was already in his 80s. He thought, I've got to hand this over. And he was wondering who to hand it over to. And the beneficiaries of the literary estate were the two Gresham brothers. That was after Warnie had died. So the first beneficiary was Warnie Lewis. And it was appropriate that because they are the beneficiaries, that they should be in charge of the literary estate. But very soon after taking possession of the literary estate, the two brothers sort of fought over it, and I think it's known that they fell out. And Douglas, who was in Australia, almost took control of it. Very quickly formed a company which was offshore, commercialized it, and turned it into kind of the vehicle that we know now. But they realized that they didn't have a face in Oxford. They needed a representative that the company could have in Oxford. And Walter Hooper was a key candidate for that. So they presented Walter Hooper with a contract. Walter showed the contract to grandfather, because grandfather was a lawyer, and grandfather said, do not sign this contract. It's far too restrictive. They will control everything that you ever write and everything that you have written in the past. But Walter Hooper, who was in dire straits, decided he needed to take on this job, and he did do that. And mostly in the main, he was free to do what he wanted to do, but there was editorial control by the company over Walter Hooper. And I want to just concentrate on one element of it, and that was that there was a requirement for Walter to remove, diminish, and obfuscate two names. Those two names are Thomas Aquinas and Owen Barfield. So that sort of manipulation, if you like, is contributing to this Tower of Babel that I referred to previously. Anyway, back to grandfather's main theme. His theme was the science of meaning. That's what interested grandfather. And grandfather was a great essayist, having written maybe 120 essays. There's already 3 collections of his essays, more on their way. And one collection is called The Rediscovery of Meaning, with this theme of meaning being his main key. And in its book, he's sort of saying, why is this important? But there's another collection called Romanticism Comes of Age, and there he's showing how we can rediscover this meaning. But the title is important. Romanticism Comes of Age is a reference to anthroposophy, because romanticism grown up, if you like, is anthroposophy. But it's not just romanticism that needs to grow up. Humanity needs to grow up. We are now in the 21st century after Christ. So we've gone through our teenage years. We are approaching adulthood. And so humanity needs to start taking a responsible attitude to the world as we are coming of age. So please, let's get ready for the task ahead. Thank you.